Hello again, and welcome to our second module in our course here. And what we're going to do in this module is continue our introduction to theological anthropology, and more specifically, we're going to continue working through our Sachs textbook and his discussion of the Christian vision of humanity. And just to bring us back up to speed, if it's been a couple of days since you read or watched the last module, rather, what we talked about in the first module, what he presented in the first half of the book, is a particular vision of the world and human beings within it. And the basic foundation of the Christian worldview is that the universe around us is a creation. That is, that it's made by God, that it is made the way it is for a specific purpose, that it is essentially good, and that God ultimately has a plan in mind for it. Or in philosophy or theology, we'll talk about the universe having a proper end, or human beings having a proper end. And that doesn't just mean end as in it stops, it means end as in goal. So there's a goal, a purpose built into the universe, and it's a good one. So the universe, the natural world around us, has a value to it. We also talked about human beings in particular, and that in the Christian view, human beings occupy a unique role in the world. And in particular, Christians go so far as to claim that human beings are made in the imago Dei, or in the image of God. And that means, obviously, human beings aren't the same as God or equal to God, but that means they share certain key characteristics with God. And obviously that's something that Christians have talked about and thought about for centuries, but on a kind of very basic level, it means that we share with God in his role as creator. And so human beings have a unique role in the world to recognize the goodness in the world, to care for it, to promote it, and even to contribute to creation, to make the world a better, more beautiful, more fruitful place. It also means, in particular, human beings in the image of God are called to be relational. And the unique thing about the Christian view of God is that God is understood to be a Trinity. That is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, three persons in one God. And obviously, that can be a real head-scratcher at times in terms of what that precisely means. But what it certainly means is that relationships are essential to a Christian vision of things. And if our proper goal, our proper end as human beings is become more and more like God, so that we can ultimately have a relationship with God in eternity, that means we're going to need to become more and more relational ourselves, and to have relationships that are like the relationships in God, that is, perfectly loving, self-sacrificial relationships that are ultimately fruitful, right? And so part of how we prepare for that ultimate relationship with God is by developing and always improving loving relationships with others, loving relationship with God, and even a loving relationship with other beings in the created world. And so that's the grand kind of Christian vision, right? That God creates the world as a good place. In it, he puts these creatures that are a combination of body and soul, human beings, to care for the world and to grow in the relationships with each other and with God. And then ultimately, as those beings develop, they become more and more like God, to where ultimately, in eternity, they will be able to be in relationship with God forever. And that all sounds very nice and well and good, and I think it is very nice and well and good, and also Christians argue it's true. But when we look around us in the world, things are obviously a bit more complicated, messy, confusing, and even depressing than that vision would lead us to expect. And that's because, of course, there is another aspect to the Christian view of the world. So the world is created good. Human beings are created good and with this goal of being like God and with God. But human beings were given freedom, right? Freedom was necessary in order for us to have real, meaningful relationships with other people and with God. But when you give people real freedom, that means that includes the possibility of that freedom being misused. And of course, that's what has happened. In the Bible, very famously, of course, this is explained through the story of Adam and Eve and the eating of the forbidden fruit, the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, of course, Catholics and most Christians throughout history have not understood this as a literal eating of fruit, but what it really is a misuse of human freedom, and it's a rejection of human beings' place in creation, and in particular the relationship with God as being one of creature to creator, where we are recognizing our dependence on God, we are thankful and obedient and loving towards God. And so that's what's rejected in sin, and that's what causes all of the suffering and death and all of the terrible things that happen through history. And so thinking theologically about this, kind of spelling out this Christian view of the world, how can we explain this? How does this fit into the system we've described so far? Well, the key thing to note, or one of the key things to note, is that in a Christian view of the world, sin or evil is not a thing. It's not a substance or some sort of power. The Christian view is not dualistic in the sense that there's good versus evil, or the light and dark sides of the force kind of battling it out throughout eternity. In the Christian view, the ultimate source of everything is, of course, God, and God, everything God creates is good. God doesn't create evil. There's no evil that exists eternally alongside and opposite of God. Right? So then, how does evil get into the world? Well, it comes in through that misuse of freedom. And what that means is that there's not kind of evilness created. What evil is explained in the book, is missing of the mark, or it's the term Augustine, a famous Christian theologian, uses. It's a privation of good. That is, it means there's a lack of goodness or fullness that's supposed to be there. Right? And so what happens when we misuse our freedom is we don't become fully what we were meant to be. We reduce the goodness of other things around us. And so you get basically a lack of the fullness of the good that was supposed to be there. And that's basically the Christian view of evil. Nobody chooses evil per se. What they choose is some good that they perceive, or something they perceive as a good, but they do it in a way that's not in the right order, that doesn't fit our nature. So, for example, if I choose the good of pleasure and say drinking way too much wine, which in and of itself is not a bad thing, at least from a Catholic perspective. Some of my Protestant brothers and sisters might differ, but from the Catholic perspective, drinking wine in moderation is good. It can be part of an overall good life. However, if I focus on that pleasure too much, it can introduce disorder into my life. I can start to pursue that pleasure in such a way that it hurts my overall well-being, it hurts the well-being of my family and friends, co-workers, and so I'm pursuing a good, but I'm pursuing a good in a way that's out of order for a properly lived life, and that causes all kinds of suffering and disorder to get brought into my life, into the life of those connected with me. And that's the basic way that Christianity has understood sin, is it's acting contrary to our nature, it's acting contrary to the way that would lead us to our proper goal of union with God through good relationships with Him and others. And so what happens when we sin or when we do evil is that we choose lesser goods over the more important ones. And when we do that, it causes all kinds of disorder. Right? And I think this is an important point to note. Right? The Christian view is not that God sort of smites people when they do bad. So it's not as if I lie and then God smites me and all this bad stuff happens in my life. What happens when I lie is, well, look, it's just a natural consequence of lying is that it's almost always going to lead to bad consequences, right? It's going to damage my relationships with other people. It can damage my career. It can damage my marriage and family. It can cause all kinds of collateral damage, but it's not God smiting me. That's just what happens when you live and act in a way that doesn't fit with the way we were designed to live and the way that leads to our proper end. So that's basically, in a nutshell, the Christian traditional view of sin. Now, an important bit to add to that, especially for this class, is that sin and evil isn't just restricted to the realm of kind of my individual choices. Right? When we talk about sin, we tend to think about, well, I lied, or I stole something, or somebody committed adultery. And of course, those all are sins. But sin can also be institutional or social, right? So that a whole bunch of people acting in institutions or society can make collaborative group choices where they set up systems, where they set up social institutions that actually work contrary to human nature, which actually work to prevent people from living like they're supposed to and from becoming more and more like God. So we can set up institutions like slavery, or you could set up institutions like prostitution, or very kind of domineering forms of government. And all of these would be instances of kind of social or institutional sin, where, look, the individual slave owner who's born into a society that's always had slaves, and they're the fifth generation of plantation owners. In some ways, obviously, they make individual choices that contribute to that sin. But it's also, they're part of a larger social institution. And there are a lot of things that we do in our life where we are part of bigger institutions. And part of thinking theologically, thinking ethically, is to recognize our role in these different institutions. So, for example, I may not, be abusing women and children in the third world directly. But if I know that some clothing producer uses sweatshops and is abusive to its workers, but I buy those clothes because I like them or because they're cheap or whatever, I am in a way participating in that social, that institutional sin, which is violating the human dignity of those workers. And so a lot of this class is going to look at those kinds of sins, those kinds of evils, where it's not me or a consumer or a producer directly doing something where, look, I'm going to choose to do this even though I know it's a sin. It's a more complicated institutional picture, but it's still a sin nonetheless, right? That you get these larger structures that are working against the nature of things, working against human beings becoming what they're meant to be. And we'll talk more about that in the coming week or two, but I think it's important to have that understanding of what sin is in order to help round out our vision of the Christian view of humanity here in this module. So now that we've talked about sin, we've seen how the depiction of the world and of human beings that we developed in the first module is a bit more complicated by this reality of sin in the world. And it is, in fact, a struggle to live according to our natures and to live in a way that's going to lead us to develop those good relationships and to ultimately have that likeness to God that will allow us to be with God in eternity. But it's really important as we kind of build up this picture of the Christian view of the world, the Christian view of human life, to add this understanding of grace, right? Because at this point, it can be very easy to see Christianity as this sort of individual effort. You have to work hard and build up enough brownie points kind of view of life, right? Where Christianity ultimately becomes, did I do enough? Did I work hard enough? Did I resist sin enough in order to come out basically on the plus side of things, right? And that's not really the vision of humanity that Christianity would give to us. Yes, it is important for us to do good and to try to avoid sin as much as we possibly can. But Christianity is not just about putting in enough effort and working hard enough to earn our salvation, right? That there's a crucial other half to the story, and a more important half to the story, really. And that is that in this world where we have to struggle with sin, we have to struggle with our individual sins and social and institutional sins, it's not ultimately just up to us to do the effort, right? That the whole Christian story is ultimately centered on Jesus Christ. Christians believe is in fact God himself who becomes man, but he becomes man to enter into the world and to basically come in and bring the divine life here into the middle of this messed up, sinful world. Right? And basically what's happening is God is kind of diving in to this world full of sin and bringing help to us. He is bringing himself into the mix of all of this in order to enable us to be more like him. Right? So we're not going it on our own. It's not just solely up to me to work hard enough. That the crucial part of the Christian view is that we as human beings have to recognize that God is offering to help us, that God is in fact offering grace, right? And as the book explains, grace is not some sort of like superpower. It's not like, a bonus you pick up in some video game that gives you special powers for a certain amount of time, right? That grace is in fact the divine life, right? It is participating in the life of God. And again, that can sound sort of, wishy-washy or mystical or something. But what really is the divine life of God? Well, right, it's this life of perfect loving relationships, right? And so when we are participating in the divine life, how we're going to experience that is finding ourselves in a good relationship with God and in a good relationship with those around us, with the world around us, right? And so by being open to God, working through the world, working through other people, and working within ourselves, it will make it possible for us to then have those same kind of relationships with others. And one of the things really emphasized in the chapter is that this grace, this divine life, is really available everywhere to us, right? That God is omnipresent, Christians say. That means he's always everywhere throughout the entire universe. So God is always there offering this help, offering this assistance, right? So the crucial step in leading a good life as a Christian is to recognize that and to acknowledge our need for that help and to accept it, right? And again, if you think back to what is sin primarily, sin is a rejection ultimately of a right relationship with God, right? Adam and Eve tell God, thanks, we don't need your help or your rules, we can do it on our own. And that's what starts off all the problems, right? So accepting grace is basically the opposite of that, is saying, look, I recognize I'm sinful, that I choose wrongly, that I hurt others, and so I'm asking you, God, accepting your help to change that and to become more like you, to care for others properly, and to have a loving relationship with others around me. And so that's what basically accepting grace is ultimately about. Now, one of the things I wanted to note is that I think this is a helpful little book for introducing something as big and complicated as a Christian worldview and theological anthropology. At the same time, every book, every author is going to have their own emphases, right? And one of the things that this book is really trying to do is to make Christianity very approachable, very understandable for everyone. And in doing that, it tends to downplay some of the distinctive aspects of Christianity, and in particular, some of the distinctive aspects of Catholic Christianity, in order, I think, to make it more appealing. So one of the things I would add to Sachs's discussion of grace is that from a Catholic perspective, grace works in a particular way, in a special kind of concentrated way, if you will, through the church and through the sacraments, right? So yes, grace is always present to everyone insofar as God is present everywhere throughout the world, but at the same time, there is something unique about the sacraments, these 7 particular actions that God set up in order to give grace in a special way, right? So Catholics believe through the sacraments, in a unique kind of more concentrated way, if you will, we are able to enter into the life of God. Most importantly, through the Eucharist, right? And so, again, we could do a whole class, several classes on the Eucharist, all right? But as Catholics believe, the Eucharist is not just a symbol, it's not just eating bread and wine to remember the Last Supper when Jesus did that before he was crucified. Catholics believe that when you receive the Eucharist, when you receive communion, you are actually receiving Jesus himself bodily and completely, so that you are, in fact, literally being united with Christ through the Eucharist. And we'll talk about that more later on in the course. But that's kind of the most clear example of what's true of all the sacraments, that through the sacraments we are united in a particular way with God. And so that's something that Sachs doesn't mention that I thought it was important to add to our discussion. But again, it's important to recognize that that's not the only way that God interacts with us. And one of the things I think that's really emphasized in Catholic Christianity that I think is appealing to even those outside of the Catholic Church is this idea of all of creation being sacramental in a sense. There's this idea called the Sacramental Imagination, or sacramentality. That is this view of seeing the physical world, all of the physical world, as a way that God gives grace to us, as a way that basically God extends a relationship, a loving relationship to us. And so we ought to enjoy the physical world, right? We ought to find joy in eating and in drinking. I've got a picture here of a nice beer, right? Which may seem kind of trying to be funny, or and there's a little humor in promoting beer, but I think there's a truth there too, right? That we might see beer as just this sort of an everyday beverage, something people use to have a good time. It doesn't seem very spiritual, right? But from this Catholic perspective, this sacramental view of the world, it is a good thing because God intended it for us, right? And in enjoying a good meal, a good drink, a beautiful scene, whatever it may be in the natural world, that through that we are actually receiving grace, and that those are spiritual acts in the sense of they contribute to us becoming what we were meant to be and enjoying a relationship with God. So yes, there's a special way that the sacraments within the Church really unite us with God in a unique way, but there's also grace available in all of creation. And insofar as we appreciate that and recognize it, that too can draw us closer to God and make us more like Him. So our Christian vision of the world and of human nature is starting to finally come together now here as we're working through the book. We've seen kind of the basic story of how God set up the world to run and for human beings to develop within it. Sin comes in and messes that up, and it causes lots of problems and suffering. But at the same time, as Christians, we believe that grace comes in to the picture as well, and helps overcome sin, overcome the problems and suffering set up by sin, so that it is possible for us to reach the end that we were designed for, and to help work to bring the whole world and others to that proper end. But there is still kind of this one big problem that confronts us, right? And this is really kind of the ultimate problem that all humans face, and that's, of course, death. Taxes is another unavoidable problem, as we all know, but we'll leave that for an economics class. But death, in all seriousness, is obviously a huge issue. And, for many of us, we probably lead more or less comfortable, middle-class American lives. And yes, lots of us certainly suffered losses of friends and family. But in general, in 21st century America, death is not a kind of constant, fearsome prospect that we face on an everyday basis. But for much of human history, for perhaps most of mankind throughout human history, death has been a very real, very constant threat. And we all know the statistics about how short life expectancy was in previous centuries. So death has always been a very real, very frightening prospect. So how does that fit into this Christian view of the world and of human life? One thing to say is, many of us, of course, have probably heard the story of Genesis. And in the story of Genesis, right, death comes as a result of sin. Now, again, as you probably picked up on by now, Catholics don't necessarily read Genesis 1 to 3 literally. Some Christians do. Catholics don't, at least officially. And that's a debate for another class. But one of the things to note, at least from a Catholic perspective, is this doesn't necessarily mean that there was a literal time in history where there were human beings who were immortal. Really what, as Sachs explains in the book, what sin brings is kind of a fear to death or an anxiety about death. Now he also notes that death has a kind of important role to play in human life, right? That by recognizing that our life is finite, that we only have a limited amount of time, even if we live to be 120, in the grand scheme of things, that's still a very short span of time. And so that means that we have to make the most of the time we have available, of the life we have available. And so that lends a certain seriousness to life. We probably all encountered some science fiction or fantasy story before where people might want to be immortal, but in many cases, it turns out that if you really are immortal, that it changes your life. It changes the way you view things, and it can take some of the meaning out of life. So there is that aspect to death that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? That it gives our life a definition, and it leads us to make the most of it. But we don't want to sugarcoat everything either. Death really is a frightening prospect, and it does seem to really bring to an end all the things that we worked for in life, right? It seems as if we could say, look, I accept this whole Christian view of things. I'm going to work to develop good relationships with people. I'm going to work to make the world a better place, to improve the environment, to care for creation, to contribute to the good of my community and the world. But ultimately, I'm going to die, right? And those relationships are going to end. And ultimately, this world as we know it is going to come to an end. Even if, none of the man-made disasters happen, at some point, X billion of years from now, our sun is going to go out, or it's going to go nova and explode, or the continent that we're on is going to be submerged under some other one, tectonic future, right? That ultimately, whatever it is we do as human beings is going to come to an end. So how does that fit into this view of life that says there is an ultimate value, that there is this intrinsic value in human life and in the way we live it and in the world around us? Well, that's where, of course, as you can guess from the page, the Christian understanding of resurrection comes in, right? So Christianity doesn't deny the reality of death, and it doesn't deny that with the advent of sin, that death is frightening, that death can lead to suffering, and be a very negative force in the world. But it also says that's not the end of the story, right? That if that were the end of the story, that would raise real serious questions about how is there meaning and value in these relationships and in this good that we do. But the Christian view is that God is ultimately going to overcome death. And in fact, in the resurrection of Jesus, God has already overcome death, right? That process has already begun. And if we unite ourselves with God, that we can, in fact, join in that resurrection, right? That ultimate overcoming of death. And so, yes, death will bring an end to this life as we know it. It will bring an end to our relationships But all of that is only temporary, right? That the sting of death, the finality, the destruction of meaning, is gone with the Christian view of resurrection. That out of death, right, there will be a resurrection, a restoration to life, and that this life as we know it will be transformed and made full, made into the real, full embodiment of everything that God intended it to be from the beginning, right? And so it will, in fact, in the resurrection, we will have the same bodies, right? It will not be a new body. It won't be like in some of the old cartoons, right, where you die and your body gets buried, and then you go up to heaven and you get this new body with wings and it glows and all this sort of thing. It will, in fact, according to traditional Christianity, be the same body, but that body will be transformed. It will be transformed in ways that we can't really understand now. Right, in the Bible, St. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians, and he compares the resurrection to a seed falling in the ground and growing into some new, huge, beautiful plant. Right? If you could look at an acorn and an oak tree, there is a radical transformation there, but at the same time, it is in some really true sense the same body, the same thing. Right? So that's the analogy for the Christian vision of resurrection. But while it will be transformed and wonderful beyond what we can imagine, it will be the same body, right? And we will be the same people, which means that our relationships won't ultimately come to an end with death, that they will be restored and made complete in the resurrection, right? And in some way, the same could be said for our work in the world, right? In Romans chapter 8, Paul talks about how the whole world is groaning together under sin for the time being, but that ultimately it's anticipating the resurrection, eternity, when sin will be removed and the whole world will be transformed into what it was meant to be from the beginning. So the Christian view recognizes the reality of death, recognizes the suffering it produces, but also says that that's not the end of the story, that ultimately with the resurrection, what we do in this life, in particular the relationships we form with God and with other people, but also our work in the world in general, all of that will have meaning because it will be transformed and fulfilled and made complete in the resurrection. We just talked about how, according to Christian worldview, yes, death is reality, but there is going to be this resurrection, this restoration and fulfillment of creation and of our own lives, where ultimately we can be in relationship with God and with other people forever. Right? And this brings us to this larger topic of end things. Right? What is the ultimate goal of creation, of the human story? Where is it we are headed? Right? Because the whole point of doing this book, of doing these modules here in the first week, is we need to have a sense of, right, where, according to the Christian vision of things, where we're headed for, what's our goal, and because that's going to then allow us to think about what we need to do to reach that goal. Right? So what is this Christian vision of how things are going to end up in the end, the capital E sense of things? Well, when we talk about end things, traditionally in Catholicism, right, there are these four last things. There's final judgment, heaven, purgatory, hell. Now, final judgment is, we can leave that for another day, right? But that's basically when God is going to set everything right? That He's going to address all the injustices. He's going to make everything the way it ought to be. And as Sachs points out in the book, of course, this is not just a negative thing, right? We shouldn't think of final judgment as God's going to come in and break out the whip on all the bad people, right? That this is also when God's mercy will be shown, right? When God will really show His love and compassion for the created world as well, right? But then at this final judgment, right, what is going to be determined, right? Where is it that people are going to end up? And of course, many of you probably heard most or maybe all of this at some point or another. Right? As we've already talked about on a number of different pages in these last couple of modules. Right, the ultimate goal is to be in heaven. Right, in the Christian traditional view of heaven, it's not floating on clouds with a harp. The essence of heaven is this perfect relationship with God. Right, but it's also going to include then perfect relationship with others and a perfect relationship with the world. Right, that again, in traditional Christianity, a lot of Christianity has gone off kind of on a separate view of things and has come to see heaven as some separate, different place that we're going to go away from this world and go to heaven, and this world will get left behind and destroyed. But that's not really the traditional understanding. Right? The traditional view is that this world will be transformed, renewed, made whole and complete, made perfect, and that we will live in the renewed, transformed heaven and earth with God forever. Right, and so that's the ultimate goal. That's where we want to end up. Right. Well, what about the other possibilities? One of the other possibilities is purgatory. Right, and this is a uniquely Catholic belief, although there's some similar ideas in some other branches of Christianity, like Eastern Orthodoxy, although they don't use the same terminology and they would disagree on some of the specifics. But what is purgatory? Right, well, purgatory grows out of the Catholic view of this life is about becoming more and more like God so that we can be with Him in eternity. Right, and purgatory is basically addressing the reality that many people won't complete that process in this life. That they will have basically chosen the good. They will have basically chosen to seek God and to do what He wants them to do. But to varying degrees, they won't have really developed and become more and more like God, like they ought to have. They'll have given in to sin more than they should have. Right? And as a result of that, they're not ready to be in that perfect relationship with God yet. Purgatory is describing a state where that process is completed, right? Where you work out the bad effects on yourself from the sin that you've chosen. You develop a better relationship with God, so that then at the end of purgatory, you're ready to be in that relationship with God in heaven, right? And so, just to clarify, in case anyone was confused, right? You can't fail purgatory, right? Everyone who's in purgatory will ultimately be in heaven with God in eternity. And in earlier generations, sometimes Catholics would tend to talk about, so many hundreds of years or thousands of years in purgatory. If you do this sin, it counts this many thousands of years. And the Catholic Church has really moved away from that way of talking about it. It's not so much thinking about a specific number of years for this sin. It's really much more kind of an organic process, right? That the whole point is to do away with the damage we do to ourselves through our sinful choices and to prepare ourselves to be with God. And then lastly, right, Christians have always talked about this possibility of hell. And Sacks talks about this, of course, in the book. And one of the important things to note, as he does there, right, is hell is not kind of this competing, separate destination that you kind of, in eternity, you're going to have heaven and hell and this big divide and kind of everybody gets split half and half. Right, the hell is really more a state of being, right? It's a rejection of God. It's a rejection of the relationships that we're supposed to have with Him and with others, and refusing to be open to that loving relationship with God and other people. And that's the essence of the suffering of hell. Whether there's physical suffering that goes along with that is something that theologians have debated, and how we ought to understand hell. One of the, I think, interesting points that Sacks raises in the book, and something that gets more and more emphasis in recent years in Catholic thinking, is that many people would argue that hell doesn't necessarily have anyone in it, right? And, well, okay, how does that make sense? Well, at least from the Catholic perspective, if you remember, the idea is that grace is available everywhere, right? And so that even people who aren't Christian, people who don't know about Jesus, people who might seem to lead lives that seem very sinful to other people from the outside, there's no way to know how God might be reaching out to that person, extending the offer of grace to them. And once you accept this idea of purgatory, for all we know, that process can continue even after this life. And so, at least within recent Catholic thinking, there's been a real emphasis on saying we don't want to deny the possibility of grace and ultimately people choosing God. We don't want to deny that to anyone, right? In fact, what we should hope for as Christians is that everyone has some way of being able to choose God and to choose a loving relationship with Him. And so, hell has always been raised up as a possibility, but there are many Catholic thinkers today who would argue that the main goal of talking about hell is to make people aware of the really serious consequences of choosing to reject God. And even if hell is not a place of eternal fire and demons with pitchforks, and even if eventually everyone would be brought to accept God and a relationship with Him, given the basic idea of purgatory and the fact that human beings do have to struggle through making the right choices, either this life or the next, choosing to reject God is going to have serious consequences for us, either in this life or in the next. And so this isn't just to say, oh, well, it doesn't matter how you live, everybody's going to get to go to heaven in the end. Instead, it's saying there are very real serious consequences for choosing to reject God, for choosing to act sinfully, to choose evil over good. But at the same time, given God's love, given that God is all-powerful, we don't want to deny the possibility that God might even extend the possibility of salvation to people that we would see as the worst of sinners. So, again, I'd be happy to talk more about that on the discussion board. But for now, I want to conclude all this on the next page by talking about what all this means for Christian living. All right, so at this point, we've more or less completed our introduction to a Christian worldview into theological anthropology. We've worked through basically all of the textbook. Why are we doing all of this? Right, and this is basically the same question that Sachs brings up in the last chapter. Right, the reason to talk about what this Christian view of the world is, the Christian view of the human person, is because that view, that understanding of what our goal is, if it's true and if we accept that, that should then have consequences for the way we live our life. And this is really, for lack of a better cliche, this is where the rubber meets the road, if you will. Right? That there are a lot of people who would claim to accept, at least basically, this vision of the world and of human beings that we've been laying out over the last couple of modules. But then, when they go out and live their lives, they don't live in a way that matches that. Right? That if you accept what we've said about the value of human life, the importance of relationships, becoming more like God, all that stuff, but then you go out and spend all of your time working at a job you don't like, which doesn't really help anyone, in order to get more money so you can buy the latest gadgets and gizmos, and that really your goal in life is, to watch reality television on a larger, more high-definition screen than your neighbors. Those actions don't match what you would claim your basic beliefs are if you're claiming to accept this Christian vision of things. And that's why it's important to think about what we ultimately believe about the world and about human beings, and then to reflect on, okay, if this stuff is true, how should I live? Right? If my ultimate goal is to develop loving relationships with other people and with God and with the world around me so that I can be with God eternally, how do I translate that into my everyday life? Right? And that's what brings us to this discussion of Christian living. Right? We have this goal, we have this race that we're running, to use a metaphor that Paul uses in the New Testament. If we're going to run that race, well, look, you have to train for it. You have to then go through the actual actions of running the race to reach the finish line, to reach the end. I'm not sure if Donald Duck and Goofy will be there at final judgment. Presumably not, but I thought it was a nice picture of an end of a race. Right, and this is also going to mean that our goals are not success in terms of money and fame. It's not physical pleasure, right? And not that there's anything wrong with any of those things, as long as they're kept in proper order, as long as they don't interfere with the more important things that we're supposed to be doing. So we need to choose to live our life in a way that really focuses on building those relationships, becoming more like God. And we're going to talk much more concretely about how we do that next week when we look at some modules on Catholic ethics and specifically this thing called natural law theory. But before we get to that, the last thing to note here is if we take seriously these ideas about the importance of relationships, we need to recognize that even if we're going to be serious about, okay, I'm going to live in a way that fits with what I say I believe and what my ultimate goal is, being in heaven with God, that can't be an individual thing, right? If relationships are as essential to the human person as this view that we've been describing claims they are, you can't get to heaven as an isolated individual, right? That salvation, getting to heaven, is going to be relational, right? It's going to involve other people and working for the good of other people. Right? When we read the New Testament, you hear Jesus all the time. He doesn't talk about getting to heaven very much, if at all. I'm trying to remember. But he talks a lot about the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. Right? And a kingdom includes lots of people united together. Right? And so the Christian vision of our goal, what we should be aiming for, is not me individually getting to heaven. It's me individually working to realize the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, more and more and more, right? And in building those good relationships with other people, working for their good, I'm going to be advancing not just myself, but these other people along with me, and that as a group, we are, in fact, bringing about the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, right? And so, obviously here, Mother Teresa would be a wonderful example, right? She doesn't work for her individual salvation. Her salvation is realized by reaching out and helping others. And so we're going to talk about natural law in the next couple of modules, but we're also going to talk about Catholic social teaching, right, which says, yes, we need to think seriously about what are the right and wrong actions for a human person to do, but it's not just about ourselves. It's thinking about how to bring about the good of everyone around us and bring everyone ultimately to that kingdom of God or that kingdom of heaven. So we will leave that for now, and hopefully this has given you an introduction to the Catholic worldview and helped explain our first book. So I will look for your questions on Blackboard. And as I said, next time we will turn to looking at natural law.